Hello, my name is Claude Butner, and I have the honor of being the host moderator for today's CACOR Live event, our 237th in the series. The title is From Grief into Growth, Reflections on Collaborations on Climate Grief and Climate Action in Northeastern Minnesota and beyond. Our speaker is Professor David Beard, who has published in the International Journal of Listening, Philosophy, and Rhetoric, Southern Journal of Communication, and Enculturation, among other venues. With Heather Graves, he co-edited The Rhetoric of Oil, published by Routledge. He is also a fellow with the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota. There are multiple reasons why rural residents experience environmental amotivation, which is, open quote, correlated with beliefs that individuals are incapable of performing effective pro-environmental action, that the energy required is too great, or that specific actions will be ineffective, in other words, low response efficacy, close quote. Causes of this amotivation may reside in the rural experience of economic, social, and civic life, where residents of small towns feel remote from power and so unable to act. Other causes of this amotivation may reside in the emotional stress of climate grief. This presentation reflects on a year-long project to synthesize multiple strands of work on climate grief and climate action, including the commissioning of multiple works of arts, research into climate literacy and climate information resources, and the celebration and invitation to participate in the assisted migration of 110,000 trees from southern central Minnesota to northeastern Minnesota in advance of climate change. Professor Beard, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Oh. So first of all, thank you all. I'm super excited to be here for a number of reasons. It's always, as a professor, when someone is interested in your work, it's always an exciting opportunity to be passionate with folks. And I'm hopeful that today I will both communicate the research, but also thank you for the opportunity to communicate the passion. The second reason I'm so grateful to be here, I'm going to talk to you about some personal stories. I'm going to talk to you about environmental grief and the spectrum of emotions. I'm going to talk to you about environmental literacy. This is the slide of all the stuff that's coming ahead. But really, I'm going to tell you a bunch of stories. And the first one about why I'm so happy to be here is I am a Minnesotan, but I am the vice president of the Canadian Society for the Study of Rhetoric. I've been so for, I think, 6 years now. And so I've been all over Canada in some ways, though I know I'm going to say that there are a handful of provinces I haven't been to yet. We haven't met in Saskatchewan yet, well, since my tenure, but I've been to Prince Edward Island, Victoria, Fredericton. Best comic shop in North America is in London, Ontario, in my opinion. So it's super exciting to me to be able to share this not just with an interested audience, but with an interested audience that's part of my kind of secondary academic home. And I hope that I make enough connections here to Canada as we talk, but I know there are more, and I know that if you share more with me, I can make this research even better and more applicable. The other kinds of stories that I'm excited to tell are going to be personal stories. I was a city kid growing up. I thought that parks were things that got mowed by the city on a biweekly basis. And so I'd never been to kind of wild outdoorsy things growing up in Milwaukee until basically I moved to Minnesota, and I moved from a world in which the outdoors was conceived differently. And so my first kind of anecdote to start us off was how I first began to experience the power of emotion in climate stories, which was working for a wildlife rehabilitation organization. I was invited to serve on their board because, as the executive director said, he felt certain that I didn't particularly care about the animals. And so I would be the member of the board that would help make sure that we continued to make good financial decisions that would keep the organization afloat, where some of the other board members would gladly sacrifice the health of the organization if it meant that we could save the animals. And one of the most poignant questions people would ask about wildlife rehabilitation, which is the semi-professional and licensed within the United States practice of, for example, taking a squirrel that's been injured when you cut down a tree in your backyard, or an animal who may have been struck by a vehicle on, I would say the highway, except the outcomes are never very good on the highway, but let's say within a city street. People will bring the animal into the rehabilitator, and the rehabilitator will work with them. And the most commonly brought in animal were those squirrels, right? And people would say to us, it costs $50 to $75 to rehabilitate an injured squirrel, and people will donate as they come in. But environmentally speaking, it's a huge waste, right? $75 to rehabilitate a squirrel without functionally moving the needle on any kind of species endangerment. There are tons of squirrels. There will always be a ton of squirrels. Why are we investing in this moment of caring for and rehabilitating and eventually releasing a squirrel? And the answer we would give people every time is that the person who would bring us a squirrel was almost always crying. They felt bad. They realized that some decision they had made as a property owner had caused the harm that this squirrel was suffering, and it created in them a powerful emotional response and sense of responsibility. And so, no, we weren't saving the squirrel for the sake of saving the squirrel. We were saving the squirrel because we knew that this moment of intense emotional connection was a moment where we could talk to them, not just about how not to cut down a tree so that a squirrel gets hurt, but about the broader questions about their relationship to the environment. Does that kind of make sense? um, so that is one of my most powerful early connections to the importance of the environment, of emotion in environmental education. The other is a work by this cellist who we'll talk about in the corner. I talked about, again, being a city kid, feeling remote from the environment myself. This cellist named Kathy McTavish composed a work called Hole in the Sky. And I have permission to show just a few minutes of it to you to give you a sense of one of the things that totally lit me up around these topics. I can stop it there just to say, you can probably tell it's a quartet composed with electronic music and art in celebration memorial of the last passenger pigeon. And the tone very much is one of sadness, grief. And probably since I was a kid, I knew that at some point there had been a last passenger pigeon. It was an anecdote that you would file away in hopes of having an answer to a Jeopardy question, watching it on TV with your grandparents, maybe when I was a kid. But it wasn't something that I felt, right? And it was the weird kind of dance of emotion and cognition in this string quartet. Me trying to make sense of the language, trying to make sense of the notes, trying to make sense of the electronic noises, that became a kind of crescendo in me, at least, of realizing that the death of the last passenger pigeon wasn't just a date to remember, like the date of the you know, my mother's birthday, but instead it was something that would have emotional resonance. Please don't tell my mother that I used her birthday as an example of something that didn't have emotional resonance. um I'm gonna click to the next slide. It gave me permission to feel things about the interface between humans and the environment. There are lots and lots of scholars who work in this area. One of my favorite is a person at Penn State named Joshua Barnett, who tells us that, first of all, and it feels like we need permission for this, maybe, humans can and should cultivate capacities for attending to, sitting with, and responding to ecological losses and earthly transformations. This became really important to me when I organized last year uh, an event which had two creative writers and a string quartet. I have a predilection towards string quartets, um, coming in to play music, and then to allow people to give them a public space where it was okay to say that spring is changing, and as your sense of the species you encounter changes, it's as a sense of the activities you're allowed to engage. Um, it's okay to express those feelings with other people. As Barnett tells us, one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. And Barnett basically argues that we shouldn't have to be alone living in that world of ecological wounds. Um, on the plus side, and this is true not just of ecology, but in every aspect of our life, loss is the cost of connection, right? Whether we're talking about the people we love or the world and the environment that we've come to love. One of the authors who came to that event was a woman named Shauna Weaver, who also, again, affirming the normalness of this experience. Climate grief is not a pathology, but a reasonable, rational response to living in an increasingly unstable environment. And I guess I want to take a look. It's not just a poetic thing to talk about this kind of emotional experience. It's also something we can measure statistically. So the Project Information Literacy, which is a nonprofit out of San Francisco, surveyed a vast number of Americans and asked them to think about a time in the last 2 weeks when you saw, read, or heard about climate change. What words best describe your reaction to the topic? And the most frequent one, 9.7% of all respondents said some word which is a variation on sad. Frustrated, sad, extremely sad, rather sad. Worry, anxious, concerned, scared, frustrated, depressed, hopeless, angry, disappointed, helpless, shocked. We don't get to a positive emotional response until number 13, and it's only 2%, 1/5 as many as responses as that cascading array of negative emotions. So whether we want to approach it poetically or whether we want to approach it social scientifically, those negative emotions are here, and we can and should have permission to talk about them. I hope we will today. But the other thing I struggle with, and I spend a lot of time working with 18 to 22-year-olds, so maybe I feel this a little more specific with them. There's a huge swath of indifference to the topic within the United States context. And here's a heat map, which is a kind of map of prevalence of answers to different kinds of questions. About a third of the people in a broad survey of Americans, United States citizens, say that they're convinced that climate crisis is happening and it's their civic duty to stay informed. There are 9% of human beings who are categorized as resistant. They don't believe climate change is happening, do not engage with climate change information. And then there's a huge swath in the middle described as the detached. While they believe climate change is happening, they just don't invest their emotions or their political and social capital into responding to it. And honestly, when I talk with students, one of the things that comes up most is they tend to presume that this is a position in which there are people who are for, people who are against, people who believe, people who deny. The real problem is, I think, not so much those extremes, but this big detached group of people in the middle. And I tried to wrap my head around what it means to describe yourself as detached. And I do a lot of work in rural Minnesota. So here's the example I want to lay down for you. I do some work in a town called Silver Bay. This town called Silver Bay, about twice a year, they get an alert not to drink the water. And there are reasons not to drink the water. The industries in the town, which are related to taconite processing in northern Minnesota, have contaminated the groundwater in a way which it's complicated. It would be very expensive to clean up, probably so expensive that it would run the risk of scaring off some of the last employers in that industry who remain in the town. And so instead, the community has just decided, twice a year, we aren't supposed to drink our water. We all run to the gas station or the grocery store. We get some bottled water if we need it, or we have some already on hand because we know that this happens twice a year. They just don't, they've come to accept, that's the better way to put it. They've come to accept that this is the cost of living in a small town that's dependent on mining. There are so many of my colleagues for whom this would be intolerable. This is the kind of thing they would write their state representatives or their other political leaders about and say, we need to do something to fix this. But instead, I think they end up in this detached group where they just quietly accept that this is what their life is now, and they don't act to change. Some of that is because it's always been this way. Some of that is because for every issue in the rural context, you feel disconnected, very, very disconnected. You feel frozen, maybe is the way to put it. You experience what the researchers call environmental amotivation, where you're tempted not to ask. And when you do ask, you get some strange answers. I can share an anecdote. There's another town in northern Minnesota which actually sought help from the state in terms of economic development. And the state prepared a report which basically said that this town of 400 could expand its economic development by adding a restaurant, which would be adjacent to a recreational trail which passes through the town. And that restaurant could eventually be expanded to include perhaps an event center where people could hop off the trail, get a beer, hop off the trail, get a beer, develop rituals around that. Maybe think that this is the place they want to plan a wedding someday and build the event center, have the wedding someday. And the um, folks who lived in that town took the recommendations and politely put them into the recycling bin because they live in a town of 400 people. Every one of them has well water and a septic system, and you cannot run a restaurant or a bar on a well water or septic system in the state of Minnesota. There is no municipal water supply to attach it to. And so they asked for help and they didn't get it, or at least they didn't get help that understood what it means to live in a town of 400 instead of a city of 400,000. There are moments when you stop trying, right? Um, Rural amotivation is not just about feeling disempowered by the grief, but also perhaps feeling disempowered by your distance from the halls of power. So this all bothers me, right? This bothers me a lot. It bothers me because I have a strong sense that as an employee of the state of Minnesota, it's my job to serve everyone, right? My students clearly, but we have a 150-year tradition of serving every corner of the state through our extension offices and through the other kinds of work that we do. So I thought, well, okay, how do we think about this? How do we try to move us out of a period of amotivation? How do we move us into a point where neither that distance from the halls of power nor that overwhelming sense of grief in the face of change that just you can't stop. How do we turn it into some action? So the first thing I did was get some students together, because man, they care, man, they want to work. And they started to work on some very local interpretations of the data. So we have a beautiful exhibit set up in the library right now, which lures students in by asking them to reflect on their own experiences, right? UMD students are deeply aware of climate change. 69% oppose views that dismiss the human impact on change. So if it's 33%, 37% nationally, it's 69% here at UMD. 94% recognize that climate change is real. They're still struggling, but at least we've got a stronger base at the front, right? 63% feel powerless about the climate crisis, yet they still have this concern. So even the students need a little help in turning that anxiety, that worry, that sadness into action. 77% believe that personal actions can mitigate climate effects, which I'm totally on board for, right? You know, everybody should recycle, all of those kinds of things. I also think systemic change is really key, that we're beyond the point where individual changes are going to be enough. 39% of students actively seek out organizations that make sustainable changes. And 58% feel they're part of a community that really want to make this kind of change happen. Okay, so we've got the baseline of students. They're talking about their own experiences, luring them in to see themselves reflected in the research and then to invite them to act. But where is the action? And this is where I got super lucky to have some of the best colleagues in all of, I think, North America, to be honest. UMD is in the process of moving 110,000 trees from the central and southern part of the state into the northern part of the state in advance of climate change. The notion is that we are presently a 3-biome state. We're likely to become a 2-biome state as the middle biome shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, and the northern biome shrinks and the southern biome basically crawls forward. And we thought, well, why not help it out? And so Julie Ederson, among other colleagues at UMD, David Abaz in the Extension Office, and a vast array of nonprofit and commercial partners across the state from the city's north, have been working together to move 110,000 trees from the southern half of the state to the northern half of the state. And if there's any antidote to that sense of powerlessness that comes from grief, it's knowing that, wait, there is something you can do. It's more meaningful than using special kinds of paper straws and recycling your drinking bottles. It's in fact preparing for what's coming by moving the trees here before the weather changes. The southern source material does better than local trees in northern environments, which means this assisted migration will work. By the time climate change comes to northern Minnesota, the trees will be ready for them. We will still have forests. The forest will look different. They will still be here, and the ways of life which are sustained by those forests, the ecology which is sustained by those forests, it'll change, but it won't die, right? And maybe that's one of the lessons here. Our responses to climate change aren't about keeping things from changing, but instead changing with them in ways that are healthy and growing. All right, so I've got student awareness on the left hand. I've got a path for action, which is emulable and exciting on the other hand, but I still haven't figured out how to move people to the action. Thanks to some funding from the Institute on the Environment, I was able to commission a whole stack of artists to help us approach this question. One of those artists is a woman named Catherine Meyer. Her work is still undergoing, so you're seeing some works here that she had done previously. She does large format drawings, which encourage sitting in front of in a dark space and reflecting, right? And it's that moment of reflection that I wanted to hold on to create some art specific to our region. These are pieces of representing the Badlands. That create the space in which those feelings that we don't feel we have permission to express are safe to express. So she's generating some large format drawings that will look something like what you see here to create that space to feel. And then we have a videographer who's created a movie called Helical Hymn. You can see that it's a project done by Amy and Dan Fitzpatrick, the first ever husband-wife project, because they were making something that was mutually meaningful, because they moved to rural Duluth and discovered an old white pine tree on their property. They were captivated by the fact that I think they figure it's lived for 200 years. When I explained to them the forest assisted migration project, it resonated with their individual connection with this tree and what it means for continuity in their space. Helical Hymn, the video they've made, is a song of praise, but a song of hope. It includes stop motion and experimental and drone videos and original music, the rhythm of which is created with the sounds of planting a tree. All of these things you're about to see in a second, but super exciting to me. These artists had never worked together as a husband and wife team. Both of them have individually said to me that it's the most meaningful collaboration, most meaningful work they've done. I'm going to show you a bit of it and you can tell me what you think. I'll pause it there. I can send you a link to the video if you'd like to watch the rest. It exists within our campus borders. It's also going to be, by the end of April, uploaded to kiosks, which when you stop at state maintained rest stops along Highway 61 and Highway 35, running from the Twin Cities all the way up the North Shore to Grand Portage, almost to the border, on the way to Thunder Bay. So that as you pull over to get your candy cane or your candy bar and use the restroom, you can stop and have a moment to reflect on some of these environmental issues. It'll be embedded with a bunch of other videos that are about raising consciousness and awareness of climate change and climate grief. It's a nice video, I think, for moving us out of that creepy sound at the beginning, which reminds me so much of the creepier noises at the beginning of Kathy's video, too, that we aren't stuck in that moment of the death of the passenger pigeon, but instead we can build towards something else. This climate migration project is the building towards something else. And then another artist we have commissioned is created what she calls a digital quilt. So she's a quilter by expertise, but she wanted something that would be portable and shareable. And so she's created a 12-foot by 14-foot representation of, well, as you can see here, 100,000 dots around the outside, which represent the number of trees the project includes. And then a border, which includes the red oak's life cycle, hand drawn in some illustrations. And then the center, including the shape of Minnesota and the 3 quadrants that the project divides the state into: the recipient quadrant, the cultivar quadrant, and the future participation quadrant, basically. This will be broadcast on the wall inside the library, but again, also a version of it with some interactivity will be uploaded in the kiosks. All of this matters because I want people to understand that, in fact, we can do something. We don't need to be stuck in the grief stage. The last piece we commissioned is called Old Oak Grove Blessings, and this is the least portable, unfortunately. They're Sumier ink scrolls, which are designed to represent the oaks that are growing in the greenhouses that are being moved north. As the artist puts it, their wish is for you to be drawn into the grove of trees, and that grove of trees has been reconstructed on campus by basically anytime the students enter the study area, they are surrounded by the trees. And as the city kid from the beginning of this presentation, I love this. And I love this because I felt so disconnected from nature as a kid. I would have needed to be surrounded by paintings of trees in order to remind myself that, in fact, I am surrounded by trees all the time, that my life is not the concrete that I kept looking at with my eyes down forward towards the ground. So this has been super exciting, and Lisa is the only one who's given us a picture of herself. That's the person who's been working. All of this is accumulating in a way that will happen on campus and off campus, where we're going to leave stickers out. Here's the plan of the stickers. The stickers are already out. They're reasonably popular because kids like stickers, right? 18 to 20-year-olds will grab the stickers and attach them to their laptop and their bottles. When April comes, and we can know that it will be closer to what we would think of as a planting season, we'll also have seedlings for people who visit campus, who visit some of the other off-campus locations, to grab one, to enact this move from the amotivation that comes from a feeling of powerlessness or from the overwhelming sense of grief, to taking a tree home and planting it themselves, so long as they live north of basically about 100 miles of here. As long as they live north of the Twin Cities, they will be participating in the forest migration project as we envision it. They can literally participate in the action. I don't know. I feel like I've tried to model in this project a way to understand that sense of grief, understand that sense of motivation, to walk people through those feelings using art, give them permission to have them, work through it, and move forward in a positive sense of action. I'm loaded down with other stories, including some Canadian ones. If it's helpful, the project on the rhetoric of oil involved some of the public relations strategies used in oil-related campaigns in Canada. The most terrifying one from my perspective was terrifying is perhaps overstating it. I need to remember this is being recorded. One of the most complicated ones was a campaign in Alberta, which tried to create some interesting analogies. You want your coffee, you want your beer to be local, you want your eggs to be local? Shouldn't you want your oil to be local to support the Canadian local oil industry and the tar sands? Um, there's tons of interesting nuances on all of these questions from the Canadian perspective that I'd certainly be happy and interestingly um, engaged in talking about with you. But I think I'm done. I think I've set out the paradigm I can offer, and I would love to hear more from you about where you sit on um, the validation of the experience of grief. Have you already slipped into the amotivation? What can I do to help talk about how you can bring some of this home to where you live?
Thank you very much, David. Very much appreciate this. And it was, for me, it was emotional and in a way that a lot of presentations are not. But it was also fascinating the way you use art to engage people. That's not a normal approach that I'm familiar with, coming from the state of Minnesota. And I have the prerogative of asking the first question, so it's actually going to be open and allow you to speculate a little bit. But I quote unquote discovered the Institute on the Environment within the last year and a half, and it doesn't. The university has a vast website and a lot of references to climate, but it's always trying to get people into a particular program, take a particular course. There's
Mhm.
nothing on overshoot. There's nothing on unraveling collapse. Uh, and then there's the Institute. And working quietly behind the scenes, it's a collaboration between disciplines that normally wouldn't be engaged. But it actually is, if I can have use the word hope, it makes me hopeful that we're going to have the best possible outcome, even if it's managing and unraveling.
Mhm.
Through the work that is done through this institute, because they do have sociologists, psychologists. I mean, there are people that work on committees. And then that's actually how we found you, because we had, oh, I'm going to
Melissa?
forget her name. Shame on
Melissa?
me. We had someone speak from the
Yeah.
Institute. So
I think
my,
her
my,
name is Melissa Kenny, perhaps.
there we go. There we
Yeah, yeah.
go. Sorry, Melissa, if you're watching this. So my general question will be, what is the role that universities across the world have to play in preparing humanity for what's coming next?
Ooh, wow. Um, oh, I wish you had asked me that question 6 months ago. um, and maybe
You can shorten it if, what role does the university have? You can tell us the history of how you got involved in the
yeah.
institute. When
Well,
did it form, et cetera?
so, I mean, the Institute started as a kind of collective of scientists, right? As one would want. I mean, I value the work I do, but I am following what they're doing, right? Is clearly indicated by the fact that it's the biology professor who's moving 110,000 trees. I'm just trying to get people to care, right? And participate. So clearly the scientists are leading the way, and that's the way it should be. It's important and essential, I think, for folks like me to trail and say, okay, now we can figure out how to make the public participate, right? Value and participate, because science is often not enough, right? My background in this, I'm in an English department, but my degree is in scientific and technical communication from the College of Agriculture on the Twin Cities campus of the University of Minnesota. And so I have lived around scientists and their abilities and inabilities to communicate for as long as I've been a professor. And it's important to have someone come along afterwards so that we make the right decisions to support them. Minnesota, for example, but 14, 15 years ago, passed a constitutional amendment which dedicates 7/8 of a cent in sales tax to arts, culture, and the environment. And it's one of the reasons why we do put art forward in some of this activity, right? Art is a way to reach across the aisle in many cases, right? Culture, arts, culture, and the environment working together in really interesting ways, even though the money is officially allocated into 3 separate pots for each of these categories. So we are a fairly forward-leaning and progressive state, and I like to think of the university as being the folks who participate as, I don't know, both the leaders in development of the solutions, but then also the leaders in development of the communication and emotional and political and social strategies to make people see the value of what we're doing, right? I hung out with agronomists as a graduate student, and the real problem was agronomy essential to the development of better and more profitable cultivars? The question was also, it's so weird. I'm working with an agronomist. He's clearly older, and he's still 40 years later struggling with the role he had in the development of Agent Orange. And wow, hard, complicated, right? Science is not neutral in all of the things it develops. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it hurts. It's up to the folks who are interested in art and communication to help integrate those good decisions and help us respond better to some of those bad decisions so that we can always move forward with what is best in a very uncertain world. I don't know that I've answered that very well. And part of what I was hiding from in answering that question is I used to imagine that it was the role of the university to innovate and to seek resources, especially from the federal government, which is the largest sponsor of our assisted migration project. It's just that the federal government has changed some of its priorities in the last 6 to 8 weeks. And so I feel a little more challenged in feeling that that's the role of the university. But I think luckily I live in a very, very progressive state where we've already committed a great deal of resources to that. And I deeply admire the general commitment across the provinces that I've worked in Canada to similar kinds of progressiveness, which is why you should totally take Minnesota as your additional province.
Thank you. And it was a stream of consciousness I was trying to open up. So there was no perfect way to answer that. Thank you so much for speculating on all that. Anitra, I neglected to say that you were on deck. If you are still there, if you could ask your question. There we
Hello.
go.
I'm here.
Oh, and Richard, you're on deck. Oh,
I'm a fellow Yank, and in fact, a fellow Minnesotan, having spent all my summers in Lake Vermilion and having owned a place on Lake Superior for the past 25 years, until I decided what was the use of me at my age sitting on the deck watching the bears go over my by myself after my Minnesotan husband died, at any rate. I'm a marine biologist and I work under the water. And I had my moment where I had to shed my skin of finding solutions for nuclear power plants and other large technological things and suddenly say, well, why don't we restore them? And that was brought about by a judge who said, young lady, you just showed how this large part of the bay was destroyed by the nuclear power plant, but can you bring it back? And I said, I don't know, Judge. This is when I was very young.
Wow.
Nobody's ever restored under the water. So I've spent the last 50 years restoring around the world. And since I like warm water, since I moved to Florida and rejected Lake Superior, I spend most of my time in the tropics and have been in all the major oceans teaching people how to restore. But my question to you is, I think it's important to charge have the pathway to optimism or positivity
Mhm.
about environment also tracked, as well as the angst and the grief of the problems tracked.
Mhm.
And so the question is, have you considered looking at those who have made the transition to a more positive model? Perhaps these students who are bringing back the 100 and some thousand trees, or my friends in Africa who are bringing back 1 billion trees through their women's groups of
Mhm.
Wangari Maathai, and now her daughter, Wanjiri Maathai, who I can put you in track with,
Yeah,
and
I would love
ask
that.
them the questions in Africa versus in Minnesota. What did this experience give you? How are you going to help others with your experience of being positive?
Mhm.
Uh, uh, Take this and go out into the world and be an apostle, so to speak,
Mhm.
for this other mindset about environment.
I love what you're saying here. It makes me think of two things. I want to run them past you because you've got experience that I could learn from a great deal here, and which is one of the great reasons I'm glad to be here. Um, Two side projects are coming off of the assisted migration project um, that are kind of interesting to me. We have a student sustainability club, and the director of that club stays in touch with the students, and almost universally, they experience a kind of fall from grace feeling when they take jobs in the real world, right? Because at the university, sustainability is everything. Everything is compostable, right? We we serve as an incubator in many ways for trying all sorts of new approaches to sustainability, and then they get a job at Target Corporation or at 3M. And sustainability is the thing you can do if there's time, if there's money left over in the budget, or if the government forces us to, right? And they feel that deflation, right? That sense of um that the world isn't what they thought it was going to be when they move through their degrees here. And so Jana is very specifically tracking their experiences participating in this project. She's invited a stack of the alumni to come back, participate in the tree migration project, whether it's in helping foster the seedlings or whether it's in helping actually move them. She's super interested in what does it look like to feel that sense of deflation and then feel that sense of happy empowerment. And I'm totally interested in working with her, following her in tracing that turn towards the optimistic and empowered sense. There is, I don't know what the results of that are going to be, but I feel like I could learn from you and maybe share some of what you're thinking about with Jana as she's focusing on that. There is a second angle that I thought you were going to go in that makes me nervous. And so I want to see if it makes you nervous too. I've had a significant number of people tell me that talking about climate change is the losing angle, right? That for the large bulk of those undifferentiated, detached people on that diagram, if our goal is to make them anxious, scared, worried about climate change, we may push them out of detached and into resistant, right? And so instead, we shouldn't be talking about how if we make these kinds of changes, we will be ready for climate change. Instead, we should be talking about if we make these certain kinds of changes, we'll be more profitable. If we make these certain kinds of changes, we will see changes in the supply chain, which in the long run will save us money, right? To look not towards making changes which are about negating the predicted impacts of what it will be horrible and terrible, but instead focus on positive outcomes that would be true regardless of whether the climate was changing. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes, yes.
And that kind of, I'm torn because I mean it kind of scares me, right? It kind of scares me to think that maybe the secret is to not face the dark reality, if that makes sense. It's a little like telling your children that they should really eat more vegetables because green is an amazing color, and wouldn't you love to have more green, right? And not worrying about, I don't know, scurvy, not scaring them about the negative consequences of only eating a bad diet, right? Part of me wants to know that they know that there are negative consequences to eating ice cream all the time.
But I think you have to do what you have to do to get the program forward. I mean, I work in Texas
Mhm,
with a portion of my time, and you can't talk about climate change and you can't talk about sequestration of carbon.
mhm,
And
mhm,
so I sell to the Texas government where I'm doing a massive plan to restore their whole coastline from the hundreds of thousands of acres of seagrass that they decimated with their 128 refineries and their oil pumping. I sell it on enhanced fisheries and enhanced water clarity for the children to play in the water,
mhm.
and enhanced endangered species like the whooping crane and the Kemp Ridley turtle, which all are complete products of what I do. So I
Mhm.
just reverse the thing and take the end product and tell them they'll have more of the end product if they do this. But as long as they're doing the right thing, I don't care which of the products they see.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Oh, there's a lot for me to learn out of this, right? Uh,
That's the Texas model.
I like it. I like it, and maybe looking back at Claude for a second, um, living in a progressive state, wondering how to make people feel okay about feeling things, maybe conditions how I'm thinking about this problem in ways that living in a state where things were much more conservative, and that heat map diagram probably looks a lot different if we focus just on Texas. It's constraining my sense of the solutions to the problem in a way that you're reopening up Anitra, and I really appreciate that.
If you take them to the open strip mine in Hibbing as the introduction, that would be the way to start. Just
Although
let them see what happens when you don't care at all. Take
except
them to those Hibbing mines,
I
and
brought a
then
bus,
take them to somebody who planted a lot of forests and
I
just
brought
give them the choice.
I brought them to the Hull Rust mine in Hibbing, a busload full of undergraduate honor students. And as you would expect honor students to do on the bus ride home, that we were having arguments about whether or not the lakes which were forming in the unused parts of the mine were somehow beautiful. And I was like, oh, kids, kids, I don't know if those lakes are beautiful. I don't know that I care whether those lakes are beautiful. I wasn't here to have you appreciate I said to them at some point, it feels like we're arguing about whether a scar is beautiful rather than asking about whether it was okay to inflict the injury on the earth that created the scar in the first place. So yeah, thank you. You are activating a whole bunch of productive angles for me to think about this in.
I will send you a bunch of poetry about the environment by one of our USA Club of Rome members.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
And it's also appropriate for me to point out that, Anitra, you are the co-chair of the
Yeah,
U.S. Club of Rome.
I am.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that question and answer session. Very fruitful. And Leon, you can turn on your camera and mic because you're on deck. And Richard, you are up. You have
Thank
the
you.
floor.
Yes, nice talk, David. I have a two-part question. One, have there been any studies to show that demonstrating that climate change is affecting population health, is actually the largest health threat to the public health across the world, and is causing the loss of millions of lives, and that it also is affecting the economy combined, so that does this lead to any incentive to people to want to make change, like the awareness of that, making people more aware of those facts? Does that make them want to make more change, or do they still feel disengaged?
I mean, that is an interesting set of questions. I do not know the answer to the first one. I have colleagues I could approach for the answer. The question about climate change and population health is really interesting. It's just a little outside of my wheelhouse. Because I care so much about rural stuff, and because I'm functionally an arts and humanities professor rather than a social scientist, I think I have a beginning of an answer to the second half of your question, but I want to be careful about how I approach it.
Go ahead.
So northern Minnesota is was a region of the earth built on what my colleagues call extractive economies, right? Forestry, mining. And so what has been interesting to watch, and this is only a sideways way of answering your question, the ways in which manufacturing has changed and the products of those extractive economies are more expensive to produce. You dig in a mine for 100 years and the quality of the ores you pull out are decreasing, and the cost of extracting what remains is increasing. And the forestry industry, I mean, I hate to say it, but I'm a book person. Paper is not the commodity it was before in terms of the value of the forestry industry in northern Minnesota. And what has remained and what has become a significant component of a transforming economy is the love of these spaces as spaces for recreation, right? And so there is a way in which you see a clash or a conflict between the people who want to save the northern half of the state in its environmentally pristine state because it's a great place to spend a weekend, or a great place to camp, or a great place to go skiing or snowmobiling, which is great, except it creates $15 an hour jobs, right? Less than $15 an hour jobs. Those low to minimum wage jobs are allegedly keeping an economy afloat, but they're replacing what used to be very solid paying jobs in those extractive economies. And so what I see is a weird confluence of resentment over what is seen as an ecological mindset, but because it gets so widely caught up with what the tourists want rather than with what the locals want. What the locals want and wish for is for the extractive economies to come back, if that makes sense, and the lifestyle that their families and parents had when mining and forestry were the economic drivers of the region would come back. And instead, what they have are affordable housing being purchased by tourists who want to have a cabin on the weekends, or have an Airbnb that they can operate and then use whenever they want. There are these weird, I don't know, there are these weird tensions between the transitions up there. Part of the reason this button gets triggered in my head is, oddly enough, the quality of healthcare in rural Minnesota is declining in the same gestures, right? And what do I mean by that? In some parts of rural Minnesota, and forgive me, are you a United States audience member or a Canadian audience member, Richard?
I'm a Canadian audience. I live in the national capital.
So I'm just going to apologize for how embarrassing our healthcare system is. Healthcare in
I'm a physician by training.
Okay. So in many rural towns in northern Minnesota and what are called critical access hospitals, they are sustained by what are called taxation districts, right? So they collect property taxes from the people who live around them to cover the basic operating costs that would otherwise can't be funded through billable service hours in these hospitals. And the tax base is changing because the employment base is changing, because tourism is replacing everything else. So we see these weird side effects. I know this because I've got a grant to study rural critical access hospitals as a kind of corollary to some of this work. These weird side effects where what used to be full-time general practitioner or primary care doctors being replaced in clinics and in hospitals with locums, which is apparently the fancy Latin word for temporary workers.
Yeah.
And I'm sure these locums are very qualified to do their job. They don't provide the same level of care, and they're not available in the same way that doctors who lived in these communities used to do. There's this weird confluence of, it's not answering a population health question, and I'm sorry that I can't answer that, but I'm making my best effort to say the weird transformation of nature from a spot that we mine from to a spot that we recreate in. And in that act of recreation, we are preserving it in ways that are environmentally sound and sustainable. And that's awesome. But we are destroying the economies of these rural towns, is having vastly negative impacts on the quality of healthcare that people in small towns are getting in Minnesota. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think one thing I wanted to point out, even if you plant billions of trees, climate change is occurring as a result of what's been accumulating over the last 40, 50 years. And by the time you plant a tree and it reaches maturity, it takes another 20, 30, 40 years. And by the time it has any impact, it'll even be 0.00 something percent of a change in terms of what it takes out of the air. That planting trees is not the answer. Not that it's not a good thing to do, but if you're expecting it to change our trajectory on climate change, it won't.
I think you're right. And my deep anxiety, and Julie, if you ever see this, I'm sorry, she's the coordinator of the project. I think the largest concern is not just, does this do something good for climate change, but also, does it maintain that forest as a way of life, whether it's for recreation or for forestry, that we're afraid we'll lose when we lose the third of the 3 biomes in the state. Does that make sense? So sorry to be critical of my own colleague's project there.
I think that's a perfect answer, because sometimes you do action because it's fulfilling. And that's not my thought, that's some other people's thought. So Art, you are on deck, and Leon, you have the floor.
Hello. Can you see me?
Yes.
Hello.
Oh, okay. Interesting. I see you, but I don't see me anywhere. Richard, thanks for everything that you do. Wanted to let you know that I am a conservation biologist and longtime NEPA practitioner. If you know what NEPA is, National Environmental Policy Act, work managing environmental impact statements and the like. It may be in the process of being gutted right now, but it's been around for over 50 years, of course, since Richard M. Nixon, a Republican president, signed it into law. At any rate, I've also worked in Minnesota at Thief River Falls, Agassiz National Wildlife Refuge, worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service to develop a plan there, and Voyageurs National Park, fire management plan, environmental assessment, et cetera. So I've canoed a lot in the boundary waters. So I'm quite familiar with your neck of the woods. But what I wanted to comment on, and what moved me right from the beginning, was your video on the passenger pigeon and the whole idea of processing grief. As a conservation biologist, of course, I'm well aware of the very sorry fate of this iconic bird, which, for those who may not know, at one time was not only the most abundant bird in North America, but on the entire planet, of 8,000 species of birds, what have you. And then the very last one, kind of heart-achingly named Martha, died in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914, and her stuffed remains, or stuffed body, is actually on exhibit in the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. So back in 2014, I was aware it was there for decades. I actually went and paid a pilgrimage to, the last of her kind, Martha, who was given a name that I'd never even heard of before. And this is back in 1914. She was given the name of an endling, Endling, an endling, literally the end of the line. Billions of years of evolution coming to an end in the form of that body when she was discovered dead on the bottom of her cage in the Cincinnati Zoo. So I just wanted to mention that as an example of the type of grief or mourning, and how we can express it, whether it's with climate change or the loss of species that, was happening in part because of that, but just because of the heavy human footprint on the earth. I also, in the way of a question, just wanted to ask whether you're familiar with the work of Connie Barlow and the late Michael Dowd. Michael called himself an ecological preacher. He had a best-selling book 20 or 30 years ago called, what was it? Thank God for Evolution. He actually came from an evangelical background, but he became sort of an ecological preacher. And they both worked on this whole notion of, how do we go from grief to sort of embracing that grief, going through that grief to, something beyond it, which sort of is a little bit parallel with what you're working on. Anyway, thanks again for everything you do.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. No, I very much appreciate it. And yeah, the Martha thing. I mean, I went to that performance expecting to, I don't know, absorb some string quartet, and I was not expecting to be puzzled and sad. And I feel like the puzzlement, right? You're watching the words. I had no idea it was about the death of the last passenger pigeon. You see these words coming at you, and you're like, what's going on? And it just, I don't know, that struggle to understand made the sadness harder, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I will be sure to pass along to Kathy her feedback. Kathy is the composer, and she happens to live about an hour from here.
Yeah. Great. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. Paul Beckwith is on deck, and Art, you have the floor.
Yeah, David, I do want to comment that on the emotional content and grief. You certainly touched me and the role of art. That was excellent. I do want to turn focus though to your comment about action, and clearly that term in my mind is a little bit fuzzy. But to even get there, one can, behave as an individual and act as an individual. But clearly, if you act as a community or with multiple others, you can do bigger projects and do bigger things. So this means that you must enter into this world I call of influence. How do you find people to collaborate with and to actually put something together to make happen? And this action, I like to say it is really directed at a plan to survive. What is it that we should be doing? The action should be going into a plan to survive. And of course, to get all this packaged in some way means we must communicate. And I just want to pass on an experience that we have going here in Ottawa, which I find very useful. And it's a social event whereby it's called Green Drinks, where once a month, all the interested parties from organizations and as individuals as well get together to, as it were, interact with each other and try and make plans. What is it that we're going to do tomorrow? And I have noticed, because I've been going to these for some time, that this community is growing, and it's filling the entire restaurant now, and it's where I get a lot of contacts, and I participate, of course, in the very hardcore science world of energy, and but I do get to meet people and encourage them to come and see my microgrid and change their way of thought. There's nothing like hands-on and seeing and knowing what a real battery is and knowing what a ground source heat pump is, and all these terms which people use, but they have no idea what they are. And this other piece of activity I get involved with is helping them to go and put solar on their roof. You know, just how do you do it? Who do I talk to? You know, once I do it, what do I do then? You know, there's a lot of confusion. But in any event, I want to turn this into a communications question, because clearly from what I've just said, I operate a lot, as it were, from the bottom up. I function in dealing directly with individuals, but I also know there's a fair number of people within the Canadian Association of Club Rome and elsewhere who can have more skills at trying to put together reasonable letters that are going to work from the top down. They write letters to politicians and very articulate and well formulated arguments, but I personally wonder about the value of these, other than making you feel good, because the politicians are under tremendous influence from the fossil fuel industry, and they're less likely to be, or at least in my opinion, and that's really my question. Do you see any value in these top-down letters put forward by, you know, dedicated people and well-meaning and everything else? Is there value there?
So I think my two-part answer. The first one's the easy answer. Local is where everything interesting happens in the world, right? Attempting to change national policy is not something of the 330 million Americans. I think 329 million, blah, 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 will never get anywhere near the ability to affect national policy, right? Local is where the action is. Local is where you can work with your, dumb things that feel small when practiced only locally, but if they're successful locally, they can accelerate up. We now use a brine in Duluth to clear the roads when it snows, because the salt was environmentally damaging to the lake, and the brine is shown to melt the salt within similar temperature tolerances without doing as much damage to the lake. A very small gesture when enacted within the city of Duluth, population 86,000 people. But you can bet once that has happened, we then move up to the state and say, hey, wouldn't the Minnesota Department of Transportation like to do this? Local is where the interesting thing happens, and we hope they accelerate up. I do think there is a role for public discourse, but I think it's the same role in some ways that I overemphasized or emphasized in the beginning of this, which is it creates a permission structure for people to feel or to see their own tentative ideas expressed and reflected, if that makes sense. A letter to the editor in the New York Times about how we need to change this or that aspect of environmental policy is not likely to change environmental policy, but it is likely to create a permission structure for someone who reads that to say, maybe this idea isn't as bad as I think it is. And maybe, again, moving back to the local, I can enact it there. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah,
that would be my model for change.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Okay, Ted Manning, you are on deck. You can turn on your camera, and Paul, you have the floor.
Yes,
Paul
thank you, David.
Love your hat.
Yes, make sure you read it correctly. This is a Canadian.
America, go away.
This is a Canadian MAGA, which is, you know, I mean, I love Americans, don't get me wrong. It's just, you know, my son came up with this logo and I'm supporting his recent effort. So, um, yeah. So my main question is, you know, can you please recommend strategies for other U.S. institutions and people on how to deal with U.S. government plans to wipe out references to climate change? Like what, for example, do you tell JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Pasadena, that's a branch of NASA, climate scientists who lost their jobs en masse recently from Doge, but they lost their homes 30 or 40 of them lost their homes to LA wildfires. So how do you give them resilience and hope from all of these tragedies that have happened to them recently? And also, maybe you can tell, I'd love to learn a bit more about the Canadian Society for the Study of Rhetoric. And are you worried about your job there being threatened because it's the Canadian Society, you know, given today's times? And also, have
yeah.
you read this? Are you familiar with this book? It's called The Bright Side, How Optimists Change the World and How You Can Be One. So it deals a lot with climate change. This person is based in London and they're very into art. In fact, they're a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts and they have a creative studio and they're trying to put science and um, climate into artistic practices, which is what you've obviously been doing with your music and poems, etc. So it's just published this year. I just picked it up. I haven't read it yet, so I can't really highly recommend it. But I mean, I haven't. I'll read it soon. It's just it looks really encouraging. You know, your talk, as I said, was excellent. You've got the smiling happy face and you project, you know, positivity, right? So I think this is very important. You know, this is a big compliment to you and your work.
Well, thank you for that last bit, because man, I was feeling depressed by the first half of your question. I mean, the only answer I can give, which doesn't feel excessively Pollyanna, right? I feel like our courts are doing their best to undo some of the firings. It won't stick forever, and it won't and put off what I think is the eventual conflict over the impoundment rights of the president, right? Which is a Supreme Court battle that I think the writers of Project 2025 are eventually trying to set up, which is to say that the Congress controls the purse and the president enacts the spending of that purse. And if the president disagrees, he can't be constrained by the Congress. This is the fight that I think they're trying to set up and let the courts decide. And the courts don't seem, right now they're doing the right thing. I don't know that they'll do the right thing forever. So all of that is negative vibes. And let's hope the midterm elections come as quickly as I hope they do is the best I have there. And I'm really sorry. And yeah.
I guess an additional point is, you know, I don't know. I've heard talk of states being, you know, saying, what is this our country? Like California, you know, very progressive states, and there's a lot of them and a lot of people. And the more noise that they make, if they're very concerned about the noise on Panama and Greenland and Canada, the best thing they could do is really start raising serious questions on secession from the US, right? Because that's a huge, what the Trump and his administration are doing is exactly what Bannon said, you know, flood the zone with shit, right? Do so many things that it's like you don't know which way's up, which way's down. So, you know, as a defense against that, you know, we can flood the zone with our own shit. Like, you know, let's have some politicians in Minnesota say, you know, put in bills and actually look seriously into secession to Canada. Same thing with California, Vermont, you know, many other states, and that will just it'll throw them off guard. It'll slow down their playbook because it seems like their playbook on what they're doing, you know, it's not just Trump, it's this Project 2025, but Trump's really mangling. I encourage everybody to read Project 2025. You know, it's as distasteful as it might seem, because it really gives you insight into what, you know, what's happening and could be happening soon. And, you know, Trump has really like it was actually talking about the tariffs and so on, but in a much more subdued sort of targeted fashion, whereas Trump has taken that and is basically running with it, right? And he's trying to, you know, everything he does is aimed at staying in the news. Like even the meeting with Putin, you know, he's talking about inviting the Russian hockey team to play matches against US hockey teams, right? And all this sort of stuff is just coming out there, and it seems so outlandish, but a lot of stuff he actually carries through and does. So, you know, it's the other thing is there are strategies well known to psychologists for dealing with bullies. Like I think Mark Carney is incorporating some of those right now in refusing to have meetings or calls even with Trump unless he shows some respect to our country. You know, and there's something called the gray defense or the granite defense, where, you know, you ignore the person who's bullying and then they feel like they're being overlooked and left out, and that's the worst thing, that feeling for them. So then they can double down and get mad, but then eventually they come to the table. So there's all these different strategies. You know, I'm sure you're familiar with a number of them. So anyway, fantastic discussions and talk.
I just want to make a brief pitch. I'm a volunteer in my role for the Canadian Society for the Study of Rhetoric, so they will continue having my free labor for as long as they're willing to take it. But I will say that they're a fabulous society if you're interested in meeting people who on Monday can talk to you about the role of the Franklin exploration expeditions in defining 19th century communication in Canada, to the next person on the next day talking about, and forgive me if I get this wrong, the tragically hip as a defining force in Canadian popular culture, to other folks looking very strategically at how social media has changed the way political discourse currently acts in Canada. They have a wide variety of experts on a wide variety of topics, and I'd be happy
So
to.
do you have regular Zoom meetings, say weekly or something like that, or
We
what?
we meet twice a year, once online and once with the Canadian Congress for the Humanities and Social Sciences, which moves from province to province.
Right.
So twice
Okay,
a year,
great.
but we're
Yeah.
we're good socially colleagues. We work together on a lot of cool projects. And
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, they're very cool. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Meg Sears, you are on deck, and Ted, you have the floor.
Yes, David, that was very interesting. I overlap in you a lot. I was head of the Canadian Association of Geographers and the head of the Social Science Federation of Canada. But that said, I'm not going to comment on American politics. It's hard enough to stomach from this distance. I am going to, however, comment on what Canadians have encountered in the past when we've tried to get people to think more broadly about where they live, how they live, and really how their humanity relates to the nature and to the forest. We did a lot of work some years ago on trying to convince Canadian governments that sustainability and sustainable development was a good idea. And for a while there, I think we actually thought we were winning, because we got a lot of the rich cats with their bags of money to actually come to the table because they thought they could make big bucks saving the environment. And when it didn't begin to pay off as much, and just remember, the whole definition of sustainable development originally was essentially how to make big bucks while saving the environment. And that's really why Brundtland resonated, because you could get the oligarchs and the protectionists at the same table, and they actually thought they were talking about the same thing. Regrettably, that has gone away, but I very much like your discussions on how the attitudes of people and of communities and really how we deal with the trees becomes a fairly important arrow in our quiver. The one other last point, and admittedly I'm probably talking too much, but the main point in dealing with forests is we were able to identify through the use of complex Canadian originated models of spatial migration for ecosystems to show pretty confidently where, under different climate change scenarios, different kinds of forests are going to end up, where they will be most survivable. And by integrating geologically and geographically information on soils, on climate, on a whole lot of different variables that affected the vitality of trees, we have a pretty good model of where they ended up now. And the people who were smart enough started to plant there up to 50 years ago when we started doing this. So there are, in fact, some examples of pre-planting ahead of the heat, so that in fact we generally got the forestry department to look at the northern edges of the ranges in which different breeds would be viable. And there's now enough data out there, if anybody's really interested, talk to the Canadian Forestry Commission, because there is a lot of information on what did work and what didn't.
Very nice. I have a meeting with Julie, who's coordinating that program coming up in the next 2 weeks. I'll be sure to do some Googling, get some of those sources and present them.
Super. Well, it began originally in the Environment Department through the use of GIS, and then eventually ended up migrating over to the use, in fact, of remote sensing and multivariate signatures to be able to actually map it from the air while flying over it and come up with decent data that would power the migration models that we were trying to do. That was done in Canada because nobody else had both the money and the amount of space to try and cover at the time. And it didn't do too badly. We did it all over the world in the 80s and 90s as well. So it's out there, even if our own government gets upset about it. And yours was doing some of it. I don't know if they are now. Ours was doing quite a bit for a while. It's still part of our foreign aid program. We still have one. But hey, it's a great reason to get out of here to the Caribbean every year.
Very cool. Thank you. I will share.
Thank you, David. That was very interesting.
We're very close to the end of our recorded session, although we invite everyone to stay for the unrecorded Q&A that continues. And with that in mind, John Hollins had a comment regarding Meg Sears. Actually, it was a comment and maybe a question, an ask at least. So I think, Meg, you will be the last part of the recorded session. And then depending on how long you engage with David, maybe John, you can hold off your comments for the unrecorded portion of the Q&A. Go ahead, Meg, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, David. This is so important because we have really, the Earth, I don't need to tell you, is really in pretty dire straits, and we need to manage somehow to get more people pushing in the right direction. And I'm with, I lead a group called Prevent Cancer Now, but I have a history of wetlands preservation, land use planning, various other ecological things. So, and I'm actually trained in chemical engineering. So my question for you is, right now we have, we encourage people to do things that will help the environment and reduce toxic exposures and so on, including climate change, from the point of view of people who are interested in primary cancer prevention. And I would point to the petition that is before Parliament right now that I would really encourage everybody to sign right away, because as soon as the writ drops, then that petition opportunity vanishes. But various other people have, since I put my question in, sort of talked about avenues that people take to come to, fruitful actions. And your work with art is beautiful and inspiring, and thank you very much. But I'm wondering if you could speak more broadly as to what is kind of most effective versus less effective from the sort of broad issues. You know, I know that people get turned off in a hurry talking about nasty stuff and so on, but do you have any other thoughts about, you know, avenues that bring people to action? You know, we've got we have cancer prevention. That's
Yeah, I don't, and I will tell you why I don't. I mean, there is a literature on this, and when we did the Rhetoric of Oil book, some of my colleagues who do marketing and public relations communication were super interested in, you know, what's the right angle to naturalize oil and make it feel comfortable, and what's the right angle to make us recognize that it's, you know, what's the right way to say this? Yucky, right? And that yuckiness begins from the moment you try to extract it from the ground, and however you manage to repackage it. Yeah, we need to remember that there's still something uncomfortable there. I can point you to people who are way more versed in that, and I can send you some resources if you think it was helpful. But honestly, my frame of reference for all of this, and maybe this is just as true when we're talking about the environment and wildlife, as it is when we're talking about the resistance to the changes within the politics within my nation at the moment, which I tell you, when I said yes to this talk, I had no idea that would be as much of a subtext. But that squirrel moment that I started with, right? You know, the moment that changes people's minds and hearts and lives, I think, is the moment when the consequences of their own actions are in their hands, right? I did this, and because I did this, this squirrel is hurt. I did this, and because I did this, I can see the consequences of climate change, right? I did this, and because I did this, my neighbor has been laid off by the federal government of the United States, right? It's those moments when you can make a clear connection between things you believe you are personally responsible for and the consequences of those actions that I feel are the moments we can seize as transformative.
Mhm.
And
I think people get so discouraged because of this vastness. You know, we want to take action against plastics. And you walk into the grocery store now, how the heck can I buy any food and not have any plastic involved?
right.
Yeah. So, and sorry to interrupt, but
Well, no. I mean, it's just when I think of somebody said to me the other day that the most effective public relations campaign of my lifetime may have been the admonition to slice up the little plastic rings that hold 6 packs of soda together,
oh, right.
right? Because we all had an image of an animal whose head was stuck in it, right?
Yeah.
And it's that, again, that direct
Those
connection,
little
right? Now, how do we translate that? The trick is that, right, where we've all been tricked into believing that cutting those rings and not using plastic straws are somehow saving turtles. How do we move that into something that looks systemic? How do we tell someone that powerful and often painful realization that what you did hurt something is an opportunity to change not just what you do, but to change something systemic? That is the ooh. Give me another 5 years and ask me again.
As soon as you have the answer, you gotta email me and tell me, because that's something that we work on and against all the time. So right now in Canada and actually around the world, cancers are increasingly quickly in younger and younger adults. So we're now seeing children, you know, who have single parents because their mother and father died, or father died of cancer. And this is a new reality that is so horrible. But, you know, all the negative stuff people kind of back away from, but so we're really struggling with how to do this in a way that people don't kind of go, oh my God, it's impossible, and sort of tune out. And climate change is like that. It's so big. And we know that snipping little, plastic things won't do it. So what we're trying to do is to inspire people to do the best that they can. So, and we'd like to change the laws so that if it's called essentiality, it's in place in some laws in Europe. But the idea is that instead of just kind of letting everything limbo dance under some arbitrary regulatory bar based on lack of evidence, we aspire to do the best. So if we want to waterproof something, we don't use the perfluorinated things, we do the best we can. Yeah, so, sort of aspirational behavior change rather than, oh, well, I'll take the next along the line because there's so many look-alike chemicals.
You're reminding me that one of the side studies I've done, because again, what I'm really interested in functionally is this rural dynamic, involved vaccination campaigns among rural First Nations people in Minnesota.
Oh, wow.
And the state of Minnesota gave money specifically to some of the tribes to say, you should design this campaign, right? If we design it, it's going to look like every other product of the state, and products of the state do not land well with First Nations people. And what they did was they offered the idea that masking and vaccination were part of living an authentically Indigenous life, right? That primary value is respect for the elder, right? And the best way to show respect for the elder is to mask when you're with them because you want them to live a long time. And masking when you're with them is part of keeping them from becoming ill, right? That a vaccination was a rite of passage, not unlike receiving and crafting a jingle dress in preparation for the age-appropriate ceremonies, right? The right behaviors were not about fear of the disease, but were instead about living an authentic and enriched Indigenous life. And I think that's where I would say, I think I see a connection. Does that sound right?
That's really fascinating. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I think
that's very helpful.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
That's a wonderful way to conclude because we're actually over time, and Ted Manning now has the floor for our official thanks.
It's hard to follow up on this stuff because we've been having a whole range of interesting small things, elements of success stories, things that might, in fact, taken together, allow us to learn something. And that's really why these sessions are so useful. I never know where people are going to come from, but I tend to walk away having learned something every single time. And I would thank David again for that. I'd like to go back into the woods again now. I've been out of it in the city for too long. This winter has not been easy on anyone. And certainly you don't want to go on TV to find out any more about it. So, but that said, your presentation was wonderful. We have got people to stick around and ask questions and want to talk, and we will have to share some more information in future because it strikes me that we're like the people standing there with one hand on the elephant, and we all have a little bit of idea of many of it, but one day we actually have to talk elephants. So that said, thank you very much for a very good presentation. We would ask everyone who does not belong to the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome to please join us, because we do have to pay to make this happen. We would also ask anyone who has good ideas or other things or other people you would like us to try and put on, please help us do that. So again, if you want to share it, please do. If you want when on looking at it, please subscribe. Please let people know that we are in fact doing it. So have a very good week. We're on again every week. We're now 200, I think we said 227 or pretty close to that now. And we intend to keep doing it. So stick with us. Have a great week.